Welcome back, everyone. Today we have a really heavy topic once more. This is going to be U.S. Native American relations from about the 1830s to the 1890s. This is topic 6.3 in the College Board CED, if you're paying attention to that. So if you were to study this period, you would notice about 3 different phases, generally, that you could divide it into. A removal phase for Indians from about the 1830s to 1850s, so moving them west of the Mississippi. The second phase would be a reservation phase, taking them and moving them to even smaller tracts of land throughout the West. And a third phase of assimilation. This goes from about the 1880s, 1879, when the Carlisle School is created in Pennsylvania, to really the 1920s. For our purposes in this unit, it makes sense to still go back a little bit to the presidency of Andrew Jackson starting in 1828. So it falls outside the time frame of Unit 6, but it does help with context here. So in 1830, he was able to encourage Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, which, remember, is going to take tribes that are east of the Mississippi and encourage treaties to be made to move all of them west to mostly to Oklahoma at this time. Very famously, the Cherokee Nation in Georgia refused to relocate under this policy, and it would take until the next president, Martin Van Buren, where they would be forcefully relocated, and that is the Trail of Tears event in 1838. 16,000 Cherokee forcibly moved to Oklahoma, forcefully walked to Oklahoma, 4,000 die along the way. Now, with that context, we can move into the unit now, the time frame of the unit, where in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, we have a reservation phase. As the march of America's manifest destiny continued pushing westward, you had greater numbers of American settlers moving into, encroaching into Native American space. So reservations were created to try to keep natives on a small tract of land that would be out of the way of these westward moving migrants. In the early 1800s, there were 30 to 60 million buffalo in the United States. But by the 1880s, it reached its all-time low of 325 buffalo in the wild. It came near extinction. How did this happen? It was largely due to railroads going through the West. Buffalo herds often lingered around the railroad tracks, causing a danger to accidents and delays. So railroads encouraged the work of buffalo hunters, people like Buffalo Bill Cody, who killed around 4,000 buffalo. Railroad companies also encouraged train hunting. This was a sport where they'd slow the train down and allow the passengers to take out rifles and do target practice on these defenseless herds of buffalo. What's even worse about this is that the buffalo hides weren't even used for anything. They were left there to rot. And finally, the U.S. Army had promoted the decimation of the buffalo as a means to hurt Native Americans and to force them onto reservations. The decimation of the buffalo is going to be absolutely devastating to Native Americans because they depended on it for so many different things, as you could see in this chart. I'm not going to read off everything there, but clearly, first and foremost, as a food source, as a source of clothing, shelter, tools. And the fact that they're being killed off is going to now starve these natives in the Great Plains that are nomadic. A famous saying was, "Kill the buffalo, kill the Indian." In the 1870s, the Texas legislature had seen the decimation of the buffalo, realized that the buffalo were nearing extinction, and considered passing a law to protect them. To which General Sheridan of the U.S. Army addressed this Texas legislature in 1875, saying, "These men," referring to buffalo hunters, "have done more in the last 2 years and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 40 years. So he was very much encouraging the continued slaughter of the American bison in order to weaken the Native American enemy. To specifically address conflict between American migrants and these natives out in the Northwest, a treaty was signed in 1851 called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now there are 2 of these, so one in 1851 and then one in 1868. We'll get to both. This first one had a provision specifically for natives to lay off of these westward moving migrants, don't attack them, don't harass them, and in return they won't go further into what is now a reservation specifically designated for the natives. This turned out to not be so much the case, as migrants did go into these areas, and in fact, the Bozeman Trail, an offshoot of the Oregon Trail, was built going right through Native territory from the Fort Laramie Treaty. And then the U.S. government started building forts along the Bozeman Trail to help protect these migrants going through Native territory, and that was a little bit too much to where Red Cloud and the Ogallala Lakota Sioux are going to start resisting this encroachment into their territories. And Red Cloud's War, taking place from 1866 to 1868, will be over this disputed Powder River Basin territory. It'll bring figures like Crazy Horse to prominence, as Crazy Horse will lead an ambush on Captain William Fetterman in the famous Fetterman Massacre in December 21st, 1866. Ultimately, Red Cloud's War will lead to another Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868 that this time will assure the Sioux that the Black Hills, sacred to them, are off limits from the U.S. Army, from the military, from migrants and miners. This second Treaty of Fort Laramie will disappoint natives once more when gold is found in the Black Hills in 1874. This is going to draw more migrants and miners to the area and will lead to even greater conflicts. In fact, this brings us directly into the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877. Name to know would be Chief Sitting Bull. He is the chief of the Lakota Sioux, or specifically the Hunkpapa Band of the Lakota Sioux. He is venturing off reservation territory. He is, following the buffalo herds. He's upset about all the new miners and western migrators coming through his territory once more since gold was found in the Black Hills. And the U.S. cavalry is sent out to put them in their place, get them back onto reservation land, and famously, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer is one of those cavalrymen. The most famous battle of the Great Sioux War took place June 25th, 1876. It's the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. Crazy Horse and Gal, these two warriors of the Lakota Sioux, lead their men to surround George Armstrong Custer's men, and they kill them to a man. So every last one of Custer's men is killed at this battle. Now, while this seems like a victory for the Sioux, technically it's going to lead to a more aggressive pushback from the U.S. military, and ultimately the Sioux will be contained. Sitting Bull will initially protest this. He'll take his band up into Canada for 4 years, but ultimately they're not ready for the conditions, the cold weather, the lack of food. This is not a place that they're accustomed to. They will ultimately surrender and be put onto a reservation. Now, there was a famous spiritual leader and prophet of the Northern Paiute people, and his name was Wovoka. Wovoka started a ghost dance movement based around this ritual he did that included a dance and a chant. Now, the ghost dance movement was built around the idea that over time, natives had fallen out of favor with their ancestors, and this is the reason why white settlers had come and been able to take over these territories. And if only they can get their ancestors back on their side through this ritual, they could turn the tides of things and get off the reservations and reclaim their land. Now, the ghost dance movement's influence spread, and it made its way to Sitting Bull on his reservation, to where the U.S. Army is suspicious of this as maybe something bigger, maybe some sort of rebellion that's building. And they try to take Sitting Bull in for questioning, and a scuffle breaks out, and he is shot and killed on the reservation. On December 29th, 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment surrounds an encampment of Sioux at Wounded Knee Creek at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. This group was potentially up to something no good, the U.S. cavalry thought. They had seen them doing the ghost dance, were suspicious of some rebellion. However, these natives were planning no such rebellion. The cavalry asked the natives to hand over their weapons and were confiscating their firearms. Now, one recounting of this event is that a deaf native named Black Coyote couldn't quite hear what was being asked of him and was refusing to hand over his gun. The firearm discharged, and the cavalry took that moment as an opportunity to open fire on the peacefully congregated natives at Wounded Knee, killing 150 at least to possibly even 300 people. This included men, women, and children. The Hotchkiss 1875 mountain gun, a very powerful weapon, was even used on this peaceful congregation of natives. Originally, this was called the Battle of Wounded Knee, but there was no fighting back for the natives, so now we term this the Wounded Knee Massacre. And this will be the end of Native Americans' resistance to reservation policies. The Nez Perce is yet another tribe devastated by reservation policies of the U.S. They thrived up in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And when gold was found in their homeland, they were forced in 1863 in another new treaty to move down to an Idaho reservation. Now, they didn't want to do that. They resisted. So instead, they actually tried to escape to Canada in a migratory effort to get out of the United States territory. And in this case, the U.S. military actually fought to keep them from doing so. And there's numerous battles between the Nez Perce and the U.S. military, again, just trying to keep them from going to Canada. Chief Joseph eventually surrenders, and his surrender speech is very famously known. I'll read the final line from it. "Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Rather than be brought to the Idaho reservation, the Nez Perce were split up a bit to where some were brought to Oklahoma, some to Idaho, and some to a reservation in Washington Territory as well. So I've focused mostly on the Sioux Nation all this time, and not the Arapaho or Cheyenne, but they do have a story to tell as well. So they experienced much the same issues with treaties. The 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty had given them the right to live on a lot of land, actually, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, which is a pretty good extent of land. However, in 1861, the Treaty of Fort Wise is going to narrow it down to only a little bit of southeastern Colorado. Now, inevitably, there'll be food shortages, and difficulties on the reservation will lead to them needing to branch out to find a supply of food. Now, Black Kettle, a chief of a band of Cheyenne, had consulted U.S. military and U.S. government agents about whether or not he could leave reservation with his people to go hunting and try to not starve to death. He had been told that as long as he flew the U.S. flag over his encampment, he could go to Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado and proceed to go there to camp out. However, on the morning of November 29th, 1864, John Shivington and the 3rd Colorado Cavalry attacked this peaceful encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho. They killed over 150, some estimates even think maybe up to 250 or 300 people, most of whom were women and children. Now, the original newspaper articles on this event said it was a battle, said that the natives had attacked Shivington's men. However, not all of the U.S. cavalrymen present that day engaged in this fight. One group, led by Captain Silas Soule, had held off, and it was Soule's testimony later on that showed us what really truly happened that day. Unfortunately, after Soule gave his testimony, he had been murdered months later, possibly out of retribution for his witness testimony. In 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson publishes her book, A Century of Dishonor, and it has great intentions. It tries to point out all the times that Native Americans have been wronged through U.S. policy and action. However, its ultimate outcome is greater attention placed on assimilation, such as the Carlisle boarding school. Although the Carlisle boarding school had been created in 1879, 2 years before this book came out, it promotes similar activities such as assimilating natives to American culture. The very first Indian boarding school was the Carlisle Indian Industrial Boarding School, founded in 1879 by a former U.S. Army officer named Richard Henry Pratt. The goal was to civilize Native Americans, to assimilate them into American culture. Assimilate's a huge word to know. It sounds a lot like the word similar, so you could use that to try to remember what it means, but assimilate means to try to teach people to take on the attributes of the culture around them, to make them more like, in this case, Americans. And they did so in a couple different ways. So the Indian boarding schools would force children off the reservation, take them from their families, put them into these boarding schools where they stayed for months, years at a time. And even over the summer, they didn't often return home. Sometimes they were put on farms to work the fields and learn kind of agricultural methods over the summer. So they taught students English, Christianity, a United States-centric version of history. They were corrected if they used their native history. They were corrected if they spoke in their native language. They were taught American culture, forced to wear American clothing. And you can see here, the clothing they wore was very militaristic. Their hair was cut, and that might be one of the most noticeable things in these images, because long hair in Native American culture is typically very symbolic and meaningful. The famous motto of the boarding schools of this era was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Athletics were also important in the Carlisle Indian School, and particularly football was promoted. And Jim Thorpe, possibly the most famous athlete of the era, was a Native American that was forced into the Carlisle boarding school. He didn't graduate from the Carlisle boarding school, but had attended for many years. He was sort of touted as an example of what the Carlisle boarding school could produce. The Dawes Act, or Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, is going to be another attempt to try to assimilate Native Americans into American lifestyle. Native Americans were never property-owning individuals. They didn't believe in private property ownership. They lived communally. They didn't have fences around individual homes or anything like that. No Western kind of concept of property. This act attempted to try to instill that upon them. It offered 160 acres of land to any family head, or 80 acres per any single adult that was interested in living on that land for 25 years. And once they had done that, they would gain U.S. citizenship and get to keep that land as well. Now, to some extent, you might say that sounds kind of like maybe a good thing for some people, but at the same rate, an overlooked element of this Dawes Act is that this land wasn't coming from just general Great Plains territory. This was specifically reservation land that was supposed to be wholly for these Native American tribes, but now it was being divided up, severaled up. Some of it is being given to Native American families, but some of it is being sold away. Most of the actually good land was not given redistributed to these Native American families. 90 million acres of surplus land were sold off to white settlers, not the Native Americans. Beyond the time frame of what we're studying in this unit, there are some good things that kind of start to happen. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge, it sounds great in premise, but one thing citizens should have the right to do is vote, and not all states will immediately grant voting rights to natives, even after this Citizenship Act is passed. However, you can argue that in 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt's Indian New Deal, as it was nicknamed, did actually go much further. It ultimately did a 180 and tried to reverse the assimilation policies of the Dawes Act. It promoted the reteaching of native cultures. It restored tribal ownership of land, promoted self-governance, allowed them to manage their own land, to manage their own resources, to start their own businesses on reservation land and otherwise. Federal funding was given to tribal education, healthcare, and economic development in general. Now that's going to do it for this video, but hopefully it helped you gather a little bit more insight into the nature of U.S. Native American relations. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.